Soon, Dad was grooming us for contests.
He was a great trainer and he spent a lot of money and time working with us. Talent is something that God gives to a person, but our Father taught us how to cultivate it. I think we also had a certain instinct for show business. We loved to perform and we put everything we had into it. He'd sit at home with us every day after school and rehearse us. We'd perform for him and he'd critique us. If you messed up, you got hit, sometimes with a belt, sometimes with a switch. My father was real strict with us, real strict. Marlon was the one who got in trouble all the time. On the other hand, I'd get beaten for things that happened mostly outside rehearsal. Dad would make me so mad and hurt that I'd try to get back at him and get beaten all the more. I'd take a shoe and throw it at him, or I'd just fight back, swinging my fists. That's why I got it more than all my brothers combined. I would fight back, and my father would kill me, just tear me up. Mother told me I'd fight back even when I was very little, but I don't remember that. I do remember running under tables to get away from him and making him angrier. We had a turbulent relationship. Most of the time, however, we just rehearsed. We always rehearsed. Sometimes, late at night, we'd have time to play games or play with our toys. There might be a game of hide and go seek, or we'd jump rope, but that was about it. The majority of our time was spent working. I clearly remember running into the house with my brothers when my father came home, because we'd be in big trouble if we weren't ready to start rehearsals on time. Through all of this, my mother was completely supportive. She had been the one who first recognized our talent, and she continued to help us realize our potential. It's hard to imagine that we would have gotten where we did without her love and good humor. She worried about the stress we were under and the long hours of rehearsal, but we wanted to be the best we could be, and we really loved music. Music was important in Gary. We had our own radio stations and nightclubs, and there was no shortage of people who wanted to be on them. After Dad ran our Saturday afternoon rehearsals, he'd go see a local show or even drive all the way to Chicago to see someone perform. He was always watching for things that could help us down the road. He'd come home and tell us what he'd seen and who was doing what. He kept up on all the latest stuff, whether it was a local theater that ran contests we could enter, or a Cad of Stars show with a great act whose clothes or even moves we might adapt. Sometimes I wouldn't see Dad until I got back from Kingdom Hall on Sundays, but as soon as I ran into the house, he'd be telling me what he'd seen the night before. He assured me I could dance on one leg like James Brown if I tried this step. There I'd be, fresh out of church and back in show business. We started collecting trophies with our act when I was 6. Our lineup was set. The group featured me at second from the left, facing the audience, Jermaine on the wing next to me, and Jackie on my right. Tito and his guitar took stage right, with Marlon next to him. Jackie was getting tall, and he towered over Marlon and me. We kept that set up for contest after contest, and it worked well. While other groups we've met would fight among themselves and quit, we were becoming more polished and experienced. The people in Gary who came regularly to see the talent shows got to know us, so we tried to top ourselves and surprise them. We didn't want them to feel bored by our act. We knew change was always good, that it helped us grow, so we were never afraid of it. Winning an amateur night or talent show in the 10-minute, 2-song set took as much energy as a 90-minute concert. I'm convinced that's because there's no room for mistakes. Your concentration burns you up inside more on 1 or 2 songs than it does when you have the luxury of 12 or 15 in a set. These talent shows were our professional education. Sometimes we drive hundreds of miles to do 1 song or 2 and hope the crowd wouldn't be against us because we weren't local talent. We were competing against people of all ages and skills, from drill teams to comedians to other singers and dancers like us. We had to grab that audience and keep it. Nothing was left to chance. So clothes, shoes, hair, everything had to be the way Dad planned it. We really looked amazingly professional. After all this planning, if we performed the songs the way we rehearsed them, the awards would take care of themselves. This was true even we were when this was true even when we were in the Wallace High part of town, where the neighborhood had its own performers and cheering sections, and we were challenging them right in their own backyard. Naturally, local performers always had their own very loyal fans. So whenever we went off our turf and onto someone else's, it was very hard. When the master of ceremonies held his hand over our heads for the applause meter, we wanted to make sure that the crowd knew we had given more than anyone else. As players, Jermaine, Tito, and the rest of us were under tremendous pressure. Our manager was the kind who reminded us that James Brown would fine his famous flames if they missed a cue or bent a note during a performance. As lead singer, I felt I, more than the others, couldn't afford an off night. I can remember being on stage at night after being sick in bed all day. It was hard to concentrate at those times, yet I knew all the things my brothers and I had to do so well that I could have performed the routines in my sleep. At times like that, I had to remind myself not to look into the crowd for someone I knew, or at the MC, both of which can distract a young performer. We did songs that people knew from the radio, or songs my father knew were already classics. If you messed up, you heard about it, because the fans knew these songs and they knew how they were supposed to sound. If you were going to change an arrangement, it needed to sound better than the original. We won the citywide talent show when I was 8 with our version of the Temptation song, My Girl. The contest was held just a few blocks away at Roosevelt High. From Jermaine's opening bass notes and Tito's first guitar licks to all 5 of us singing the chorus, we had people on their feet for the whole song. Jermaine and I traded verses while Merlin and Jackie spun like tops. It was a wonderful feeling for all of us to pass that trophy, our biggest yet, back and forth between us. Eventually, it was propped under the front seat like a baby, and we drove home with Dad telling us, "When you do it like you did tonight, they can't not give it to you." We were now Gary City champions, and Chicago was our next target because it was the area that offered the steadiest work and the best word of mouth for miles and miles. We began to plan our strategy in earnest. My father's group played the Chicago sound of Muddy Waters and Howling Wolf, but he was open-minded enough to see that the more upbeat, slicker sounds that appealed to us kids had a lot to offer. We were lucky because some people his age weren't that hip. In fact, we knew musicians who thought the 60s sounds was beneath people their age, but not Dad. He recognized great singing when he heard it, even telling us that he saw the great doo-wop group from Gary, the Spaniels, when they were stars, not that much older than we. When Smokey Robinson of the Miracles sang a song like Tracks of My Tears or Ooh Baby Baby, he'd be listening as hard as we were. The 60s didn't leave Chicago behind musically. Great singers like The Impressions with Curtis Mayfield, Jerry Butler, Major Lance, and Tyrone Davis were playing all over the city at the same places we were. At this point, my father was managing us full-time, with only a part-time shift at the mill. My mom had some doubts about the soundness of this decision, not because she didn't think we were good, but because she didn't know anyone else who was spending the majority of his time trying to bring his children into the music business. She was even less thrilled when Dad told her he had booked us as a regular act at Mr. Lucky's, a Gary night spot. We were being forced to spend our weekends in Chicago and other places trying to win an ever-increasing number of amateur shows, and these trips were expensive. So the job at Mr. Lucky's was a way to make it all possible. Mom was surprised at the response we were getting, and she was very pleased with the awards and the attention, but she worried about us a lot. She worried about me because at my age, "This is quite a life for a 9-year-old," she would say, staring intently at my father. I didn't know what my brothers and I expected, but the nightclub crowds weren't the same as the Roosevelt High crowds. We were playing between bad comedians, cocktail organists, and strippers. With my witness upbringing, Mom was concerned that I was hanging out with the wrong crowd, people, and getting introduced to things I'd be better off learning much later in life. She didn't have to worry. Just one look at some of those strippers wasn't going to get me that interested in trouble. Certainly not at 9 years old. That was an awful way to live, though, and it made us all the more determined to move on up the circuit and as far away from that life as we could go. Being at Mr. Lucky's meant that for the first time in our lives, we had a whole show to do. 5 sets a night, 6 nights a week, and if Dad could get something out of town for the 7th night, he was going to do it. We were working hard, but the bar crowds weren't bad to us. They liked James Brown and Sam and Dave just as much as we did, and besides, we were something extra that came free with the drinking and the carrying on, so they were surprised and cheerful. We even had some fun with them on the one number, the Joe Tex song, Skinny Legs and all. We'd start the song, and somewhere in the middle, I'd go out into the audience, crawling under the tables, and pull out the ladies' skirts to look under. People would throw money as I scurried by, and when I began to dance, I'd scoop up all the dollars and coins that hit the floor earlier and push them into the pockets of my jacket. I wasn't really nervous when we began playing in clubs because of all the experience I've had with talent show audiences. I was always ready to go out and perform, just do it, sing and dance and have some fun. We worked in more than one club that had strippers in those days. I used to stand in the wings of this one place in Chicago and watch a lady whose name was Mary Rose. I must have been 9 or 10. This girl would take off her clothes and her panties and throw them to the audience. The men would pick them up and sniff them and yell. My brothers and I would be watching all of this, taking it in, and my father wouldn't mind. We were exposed to a lot during that kind of circuit. In one place, they had cut out a little hole in the musician's dressing room wall that also happened to act as a wall in the ladies' bathroom. You could peek through this hole, and I saw stuff I'd never forgotten. Guys on that circuit were so wild. They did stuff like drilling little holes into the walls of the ladies' room all the time. Of course, I'm sure that my brothers and I were fighting over who got to look through the hole. "Get out of my way, it's my turn," pushing each other away to make room for ourselves. Later, when we did the Apollo Theater in New York, I saw something that really blew me away because I didn't know things like that existed. I had seen quite a few strippers, but that night, this one girl with gorgeous eyelashes and long hair came out and did her routine. She put on a great performance. All of a sudden, at the end, she took off her wig, pulled a pair of big oranges out of her bra, and revealed that she was a half-faced man under all that makeup. That blew me away. I was only a child and couldn't even conceive of anything like that. But I looked out at the theater audience and they were going for it, applauding wildly and cheering. I'm just a little kid standing in the wings watching this crazy stuff. I was blown away. As I said, I received quite an education as a child, more than most. Perhaps this freed me to concentrate on the other aspects of my life as an adult. One day, not long after we'd been doing successfully in Chicago clubs, Dad brought home a tape of some songs we'd never heard before. We were accustomed to doing popular stuff off the radio, so we were curious why he began playing these songs over and over again. Just one guy singing none too well with some guitar chords in the background. Dad told us that the man on the tape wasn't really a performer, but a songwriter who owned a recording studio in Gary. His name was Mr. Keith, and he had given us a week to practice his songs to see if we could make a record out of them. Naturally, we were excited. We wanted to make a record, any record. We worked strictly on the sound, ignoring the dancing routines we'd normally work up for a new song. It wasn't as much fun to do a song that none of us knew, but we were already professional enough to hide our disappointment and give it all we could. When we were ready and felt we had done our best with the material, Dad got us on tape after a few false starts and more than a few pep talks, of course. After a day or two of trying to figure out whether Mr. Keith liked the tape we had made for him, Dad suddenly appeared with more of his songs for us to learn for our first recording session. Mr. Keith, like Dad, was a mill worker who loved music, only he was more into the recording and business end. His studio and label were called Steel Town. Looking back on all this, I realized Mr. Keith was just as excited as we were. His studio was downtown, and we went early on one Saturday morning before the road running show, my favorite show at that time. Mr. Keith met us at the door and opened the studio. He showed us a small glass booth with all kinds of equipment in it and explained what various tasks each performed. It didn't look like we'd have to lean over any more tape recorders, at least not in this studio. I put on some big metal headphones, which came halfway down my neck, and tried to make myself look ready for anything. As my brothers were figuring out where to plug in their instruments and stand, some backup singers and a horn section arrived. At first, I assumed they were there to make a record after us. We were delighted and amazed when we found out they were there to record it with us. We looked over at Dad, but he didn't change expression. He'd obviously known about it and approved. Even then, people knew not to throw Dad surprises. We were told to listen to Mr. Keith, who would instruct us while we were in the booth. If we did as he said, the record would take care of itself. After a few hours, we finished Mr. Keith's first song. Some of the backup singers and horn players hadn't made records either and found it difficult, but they also didn't have a perfectionist for a manager, so they weren't used to doing things over and over the way we were. It was at times like this that we realized how hard Dad worked to make us consummate professionals. We came back the next few Saturdays, putting the songs we'd rehearsed during the week into the can and taking home a new tape of Mr. Keith's each time. One Saturday, Dad even brought his guitar in to perform with us. It was the one and only time he ever recorded with us. After the records were pressed, Mr. Keith gave us some copies so that we could sell them between sets and after shows. We knew that wasn't how the big groups were doing it, but everyone had to start someplace. And in those days, having a record with your group's name on it was quite something. We felt very fortunate. That first Steel Town single, Bad Boy, had a mean bass line. It was a nice song about a kid who wanted to fall in love with some girl. Of course, in order to get the full picture, you have to imagine a skinny 9-year-old singing the song. The words said, I didn't want to hear fairy tales anymore, but in truth I was far too young to grasp the real meanings of most of the words in those songs. I just sang what they gave to me. When that record with its killer bass line began to get radio play in Gary, we became a big deal in our neighborhood. No one could believe we had our own record. We had a hard time believing it. After that first Steel Town record, we began to aim for all the big talent shows in Chicago. Usually the other acts would look me over carefully when they met me, because I was so little, particularly the ones who went on after us. One day, Jackie was cracking up, like someone had told him the funniest joke in the world. This wasn't a good sign right before a show, and I could tell Dad was worried. He was going to screw up on stage. Dad went over to say a word to him, but Jackie whispered something in his ear, and soon Dad was holding his eyes laughing. I wanted to know the joke too. Dad said proudly that Jackie had overheard the headlining acts talking amongst themselves. One guy said, "We better not let those Jackson 5 cut us tonight with that midget what they've got." I was upset at first because my feelings were hurt. I thought they were being mean. I couldn't help it that I was the shortest, but soon all the other brothers were cracking up too. Dad explained that they weren't laughing at me. He told me that I should be proud. The group was talking trash because they thought I was a grown-up posing as a child like one of the Munchkins in The Wizard of Oz. Dad said that if I had those slick guys talking like that, neighborhood kids who gave us grief back in Gary, then we had Chicago on the run. We still had some running of our own to do. After we played some pretty good clubs in Chicago, Dad signed us up for the Royal Theatre Amateur Night Competition in town. He had gone to see B.B. King at the Regal the night he had made his famous live album. When Dad gave Tito that sharp red guitar years earlier, we had teased him by thinking of girls he could name his guitar after, like B.B. King's Lucille.